All right.
I'll just mention one bit as we get in here. We'll be talking about the story of us and our discussions, our interactions at Parts Unlimited. And what we're going to be telling you is going to be based on a collage of real client experiences. So we're going to be describing what we see typically and putting it into the world of Parts Unlimited. So that's going to be the connection. In case you're wondering, how did they get such deep embedded transformation in the world of the Unicorn Project and the Phoenix Project, understand this is based on the patterns that we've seen again and again. So in this case, the story we're about to tell of Parts Unlimited is very, very typical.
Great, but we didn't kind of warp ourselves into the book. We don't have magic to actually meet Max and
right.
Steve and everyone else.
The never-ending story.
It's not like that. Be fun, but not what happened.
Right.
We should introduce ourselves first. So I'm Squirrel. That is really my name. So you can call me that name.
And I'm Jeffrey Fredrick. And together we have a podcast on troubleshooting Agile. And you can find out about the book we have coming up in May, Agile Conversations, and much more at conversationaltransformation.com. And what we're going to be talking about is how we work with companies to change their culture by changing their conversations. And with that, I think let's get in and talk about Absolutely. The situation at Parts Unlimited. What would happen for us is we were minding our own business, and we got a call then from Erik.
Was he down the pub when he was joining us? I don't remember.
No, he was saying that there was a bit of a crisis with the company he was working with. That he had been working with, talking to them about joining their board, and that there was a real serious problem. That they had no CIO, that they had been losing market share, and then they've had this disastrous platform launch that had made the news for all the wrong reasons. I had seen it actually, that the Parts Unlimited tried to roll out the Phoenix project they'd been promising for years, and actually ended up taking a bunch of their point of sale systems offline. So it was just
I remember we used it as an example in our podcast, because we said, this is an example of one of those digital transformations that's gone wrong.
Yeah.
And we always think that there's a conversation at the heart of that. And that's lo and behold, Erik phones us up and asks us to help out.
Right. And now the crisis kind of in two parts. You have this sort of long unfolding crisis that was going on that had been sort of years in the making, but it had really become quite acute because Steve was acting as CIO, and was really relying quite a bit on the VP of Operations to help sort things out. And that VP of Operations just resigned. And Erik,
Bill Palmer, is that the guy's name?
That's right. So Bill had just resigned. Erik was really blaming Steve. Had convinced him. This is a Friday. We got the email and said, "Guys, would you mind getting on the call with Steve tomorrow? I know it's a Saturday, but it's really important because." He wants to try to get Bill back, and that was the first time for us to really engage with Parts Unlimited. Now I was a fan of this because I had used their products when I was in university.
I'm terrible with cars, so I didn't know anything about it.
Kept my old green Pinto running much longer than you ever would have expected. So I was quite happy to take this and be able to step in and help. So we had the call with Steve and try to demonstrate. He was a bit skeptical. I think he was understood that things needed to change, but he and Erik had convinced him that Steve needed to change what he was doing, but he just didn't understand that conversations are a skill. A lot of people come into conversations thinking, well, I've had conversations my whole life. What's there to learn?
Since I was 2, right? Mama, cookie. I was good at that. Why do I need to learn anything else?
But we're going to explain here over the course of this webinar the models that we're using to demonstrate that conversations, that you can have skillful conversations that are much more productive than the sort of naive, unskillful ones. And I think over the course of that call, probably an hour, maybe a bit less even, we worked with Steve to talk about how he could effectively communicate with Bill, starting with the call that he was going to make to try to convince him to come back.
Because that's one of the great lessons about conversations is you often have them repeatedly, and so you get many chances to practice, and you can prepare for them so that you can have a better conversation. And this was a really consequential conversation, because if Bill didn't come back, I think Erik was going to have a cow with Steve, and that was going to be a real problem. Yeah. And Steve could see that firing Bill had been a mistake.
Bill resigning.
Resigning. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot the details. But Bill not being in the building was a horrible catastrophe.
Right.
And so it was a huge multi-million pound conversation, really.
Right. So we had that, and on the basis of that success, we then had further engagements. Steve could see the value of it, and we rolled out a whole plan, which we'll talk a bit about the steps we went through. And I think a year later, you can see the complete change at Parts Unlimited. Real turnaround, gaining market share, and really technically led. And I'm saying this is a company where they were considering outsourcing all of IT, now looking at IT as the source of innovation. So a real change. And it wasn't IT. And I think one of the big steps here was to stop looking at IT as some sort of stepchild, servant to the rest of the business, but really embedding it in. And that is not something you do with a pen and an org chart. You don't just move. You
don't just write an email.
You don't write an email.
Everybody behaves differently.
Moving the developers into the building with business is certainly good, but it's not sufficient. That does not, by itself, give you a different culture.
Can you just shut up those salespeople? They're making too much noise. I can hear them through my earphones.
That's right. And so that's not it. So we worked with them to make sure that they had a guided transformation of the conversations, and it's been fantastically successful. And the results speak for themselves. And now, having understood why they were so motivated and what the payoffs can be, let's get into a bit of the how. So we'll start with why would you care about this at all? I mean, if you're considering one of these sort of DevOps transformations or Agile transformations or digital transformations, like
lean transformation, something transformation,
right? Why would that be hard? I mean, I think if anyone who is familiar with the literature, they understand that most of these transformations fail. And I think it really shouldn't be surprised because, as I said, it's not something you can do with an email with just moving people around.
The hint's in the name. You're supposed to transform. It's supposed to be completely different. And that's a very difficult thing to make happen.
And especially because what you're looking at is how people relate to one another. I think this is what makes it so challenging, is it really comes down to people. What you're trying to change is the culture, and your culture is the sum total of all the interactions, of all the conversations everyone in your company is having all the time. And changing people's behaviors, changing their habits of thought and of speech, it's definitely possible. There's a science to it. It takes time and effort. And usually people don't appreciate that there is a process you can follow, that there is science, that there are skills involved. And instead, they're left with just sort of cargo cult advice. We'll just push people together. If I put them in the same org chart, if I align their OKRs, if there's financial incentives, it'll all just work. Now, those things work sometimes.
Yeah, but you could get lucky. Get lucky is a plan, Jeffrey likes to say.
Yeah, that's right. That's a strategy.
It's not a very good strategy.
It works for some people. It might work for you. It wasn't working at Parts Unlimited. And so there's a better answer. And one of the ways you can look at this, this came across the idea that came across, I think it was last year, that I had my first exposure to it, was this idea of 3 cultures. And Ron Westrum was looking at organizations, and what he said is you can understand the culture by looking at how information flows within the culture.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, he was looking at hospitals, which is another very complex organization with lots and lots of interactions, very similar to Parts Unlimited.
That's right. And he typified that he could say, I could see 3 different main types of cultures. And you can probably just tell by the names that he thought that some of them were better than others.
Yeah, I really want to be pathological. That sounds great. Let's sign up for pathological.
And the idea in a pathological culture is it's driven by individuals and who are looking at their own personal power, needs, and glory. This is a kind of environment where messengers are shot. You're bringing bad news, you're likely to be fired. Mm-hmm. And I think for people who've been reading Unicorn Project and understand the case study there, you can probably identify some of the characters who exhibit pathological behavior.
Yep.
In
our engagement, we observed a couple of cases where there were people who were just fired out of the blue for something that they were blamed for.
Right.
They were the messenger coming to say, hey, by the way, this delivery was terrible. and they were on the street the next day.
And that's typical of a pathological culture, is that if there's a problem, there must be a person behind the problem, and accountability means people get fired. So it's a very unproductive environment.
Yep.
The second type of culture that Ron Westrum identified was bureaucratic. And this is where what really matters is the rules. And again, I think there's some of that you can see in both Phoenix Project and Unicorn Project. You could see that there were areas and departments where what really mattered was, did you fill out the right tickets? Did you have the approval? Did you have the sign-off? And the information is not flowing where it needs to go. Instead, you have all these different silos and bureaucracy that's built up. Because people are more focused on, are the rules being followed or the processes being followed, than are we getting the result?
And by the way, that's quite adaptive in certain cases. So we met this very superstar developer named Max, who had got a really nice tour of kind of the whole organization. She kept talking about the square. And she would talk about how you had to go up, and then you had to go across, and then you had to go down.
Yeah.
And that was probably adaptive at some stage in those particular cases where it was useful to, Jeffrey, you really screwed up my code. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure there's this big wall between us.
Yeah.
And you over there in QA, you can't mess up my environment. So anytime you want an environment, you have to go up to my manager, your manager, it goes to my manager, it goes down to me.
Well, like you say, adaptive, but probably in two ways. One is a way to avoid getting fired.
Exactly.
If you're in an environment. And the second is, like you said, these probably things developed creatively over time. Each individual one probably had a rationale for it. It probably seemed good on paper. It seemed there was a logic to it. But over time, the entire edifice is built that is no longer serving the real needs.
Yep. And there was a perfect example that we were really glad to get rid of. We're glad that the company eventually rid itself, and it had some crazy name like Lebtar Board. I can't remember what it was called, but I don't remember what it stood for, but it was all about delaying and slowing down innovation.
The anti-innovation board, is I think you could have thought of it. Now, the third type of culture where you want to get in a transformation is a generative culture. And a generative culture is one where information flows to where it's needed from sources that have it. But this happens naturally when there's the right focus. When the focus is on the mission, are we getting the outcomes that we want, rather than issues of individual power or bureaucratic correctness.
And an interesting thing about Parts Unlimited is it had all these three different cultures kind of mixed in together.
Which is really typical.
Exactly.
If you have an organization of sufficient size, you're pretty much guaranteed to have all three in different places. And so the challenge of leadership and the challenge of transformation is, how do I create an environment and a culture that will promote the generative aspects and identify, stifle, and otherwise remove the pathological and bureaucratic elements.
Yeah, but when we came to Parts Unlimited, what we observed was encouragement of the bureaucratic and to some extent pathological elements, and squashing of, for example, when Max got moved, that was how we met her, as she got moved into the Phoenix Project, and that was squashing her generative environment and her generative behavior. Not very popular with her. Didn't work out very well.
So now with these three cultures, if we go back to the overall, what happens at the top level, the leadership of the company is going to have a approach to transformation that matches their personal culture. And in the cases where we see that people have a pathological culture, then what we see is very much a directed top-down, and sort of, it doesn't change the culture, it reinforces the elements of fear. This is what we're going to do. It's happening. And if you don't like it,
we're releasing Phoenix to the stores tomorrow.
You should quit.
5 o'clock. Get it out. Here's more pizza.
Right. And I just think this is not a transformation process that's likely to succeed.
I've never seen it succeed.
All right. Similarly, the bureaucratic approach, I often doesn't work as well. It has a higher chance of success in a sense. I remember
very slow. That's the main thing.
It's very slow.
Because it's squares on squares on squares, because you're having to go to permission for everything and make sure that you get the approval of 10 different boards before you can do something.
And I think one of the signs for me of the bureaucratic approach to transformation is we're going to bring in some large scale framework for whatever we're doing. And we have some manual, you all need to get certified in the new approach. And I think that's one of the signs for me is the idea that we're going to be able to get the right answer because everyone's been certified.
Mm-hmm.
That's a wishful thinking approach. Once everyone signed off and they have the right credentials, then certainly things will work. It's not impossible. It has had some success in some places, but I think that it can be both slow and error prone.
It's more adaptive for situations where the thing you're trying to transform into is extremely well known and really understood. So if we were trying to transform from all of us using pencils to all of us using pens, we could be certified in pens. We could get officially certified and approved pens. And we could all throw away all our pencils and remove all the pencil sharpeners.
Right.
We'd understand that. We all know what a pencil and a pen is.
Right, and that's not really a cultural transformation.
Exactly.
That's a process transformation.
Precisely.
And I think it's a good example when you're moving from one well-defined thing to another well-defined thing. Sure, this can work. But when you're looking to change the culture, you're looking to change how people interact, the only sort of reproducible approach I've seen is a generative approach, which is one that's much more adaptive because you're looking at our specific situation, our goals and needs, and you're running through this cycle where you're saying, are we making progress? If not, how do we change and adjust? And looking for those pain points as areas of learning. And as a contrast to the pathological, which says any problems are to be punished, it says, how can we learn from them? How can we change? It looks a bit like let's try to get the bad news up soon and come up with solutions.
Makes sense. So, but Jeffrey, we've done something really terrible, and I'm feeling awful. And it's something that's so terrible that when I read 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, I threw it across the room because I got so angry that the author had done this. We've told people what they should do. We've told them what the results should look like.
Yeah.
And some books and some presentations, actually most of them that I see, stop here.
Yeah.
And they just say, you should do a generative transformation. Thank you very much. We'll collect our fee and we're, please buy our book and thanks very much. We got another half hour. I think we should talk about how you actually do this.
That's right.
We should give some instructions for step by step. What would you do to make this happen?
Right. And this is the point, is that if you want to change your culture, what you're going to do is start to change the conversations. And what we're walking through here is the process that's not something we created. This is something we've curated from multiple sources, primarily leaning on the domain of action science from Chris Fredrick. And what we're going to talk about is how, if you want to change your conversations, you start with literally changing your conversations, and that this is a skill you can develop. We tend to try to start as high in an organization as possible. So this is where it was very helpful at Parts Unlimited to start with the CEO and then work down.
Yep.
Because of course, those conversations will have the most leverage. But we've also seen this kind of transformation start from the team level and then generally work its way up.
And our friend Max certainly started that way.
Sure.
The
rebellion
exactly.
in general was
Erik was down there at the pub, handing out the drinks and encouraging the rebellion. And I remember her telling us about one case where she kind of blurted out, "Good luck, chumps," in the moment when she was going to try to install Phoenix for the deployment. And that was the start. Maybe not the most skilled conversational transformation, but it was certainly a start toward a different way of interacting that worked better. So you can start it at the bottom or the top or both.
Right. And the good news is you already know what the results of the conversations at the end, after the transformation, what they should look like. And we're going to test this with you right now. Here's the scenario. Imagine that you and 5 of your friends, or maybe you and the people here on the webinar, are going to make an important decision. Guess what, Alex? Good news is that we're all today going to decide where next year's DevOps Enterprise Summit Conference should be. Yeah,
forget Las Vegas. We didn't like it. We're having a rebellion, Alex. We're going to move it someplace else.
Now, we'll ask all of you, and you can answer in the Slack chat. You can say, how would you propose that we make that decision? Not to be clear, not what is the decision. If it was up to Squirrel, he knows where he wants it to be.
Folkestone sounds great. You can have it at my house.
Yeah. So, but how would we go about this? What process would you do? What would be the first step if it was up to us? How would you ask that we approach it?
Makes sense. We'll look at the Slack chat later. We don't have it up right now, but we will have a look later and see what ideas you come up with. So please do share them there because we're interested in what your thoughts are on how you make that decision. I see some of you might be doing it in the Zoom chat as well. That'll be harder for us to see, so Slack chat's probably better, and we'll weigh in there. But let's keep going because I bet we know what people are putting in the Slack chat, even though we're not looking at it right this moment.
Yeah, and we should be clear, what we're asking is the process leading to decision, not the decision-making rule itself.
Precisely. Yeah.
Right? The decision-making rule of like, will Alex be the one to decide, or will it be Gene, or will it be a vote? That's the decision-making rule. The question is what comes before that. And what always happens whenever we ask this question, we were doing a workshop earlier
just
today,
this morning, yeah.
And we asked the people the question, we chose someone, if it was up to you, what would you do? And they said, well, we'd want to make a list. We get everyone's ideas. We want to hear what everyone's ideas are and the why they have them. And we're like, oh, and would you share yours too? And they said, of course. And we said, okay, great. So what's happening is you're going to be transparent with your ideas and you're going to be curious about everyone else's. And when you bring all the information together, that's when you'll decide. In other words, you want to be transparent and curious to gather as much information as possible to make the best possible decision.
And that's exactly what everyone says.
Everyone says this.
Yep.
That's what we mean by saying you already know what the result looks like.
The problem is it's very difficult to produce.
That's right.
And if you think, just think to yourself, think through the last couple of meetings you've had. Were they diverse? Did everyone share their point of view? Were they effective and were they useful collaborative conflict? Usually when we ask that question, most people say no. And that's because although everyone in that meeting, if you'd ask them the same question, would say, I want to have these first three as the characteristics, when the situation actually matters, when the stakes are high, we all behave differently.
That's right. And it's very funny because people would say that the more opinions we get, the more information comes in, the better it will be. But then when it actually happens and people have different opinions, they're offended and they're angry because people are obviously wrong.
Jeffrey, exactly. My way is obviously correct. So, we obviously should have it in Folkestone because I have the nicest place and a beautiful place for everyone.
I'm not even listening anymore.
Yeah, of course.
We should be in Antarctica because they have penguins.
Penguins. Oh yeah, he's always on about penguins. So that it's obviously, but that kind of thinking is what exactly gets you in trouble because you're thinking to yourself, I know all the answers. I'm going to make sure that my idea wins. I tend to outlaw for people I coach the word convince because you come into the meeting and say, oh, I'm just going to convince them. I'll explain how it all works.
Once they understand,
once they understand it all,
everyone will agree with me.
Exactly. And how could I convince them better, Squirrel? And I just say, you're not allowed to say that anymore.
Yeah. And now I want to be clear because you said we're thinking this or saying this to ourselves, but we're actually not. This is something that happens automatically and unconsciously. This is normal human behavior. When there's the chance for embarrassment or threat, what we do is stop listening and stop sharing what we know. And it's not a conscious choice we're making. It's just something we've been acculturated to do. And it takes practice to develop the skills to behave otherwise. Now, that sounds great. How do you actually go about gaining skills? And the good news is there's tools to help you do this. And here's one tool that we brought into Parts Unlimited. And this is a tool that we bring in. We talked about this on our podcast. We
did it in the seminar this morning.
That's right.
We're always talking about the ladder of inference. And my favorite name for it, by the way, is test-driven development for people. So we'll explain how that works and why we call it that.
Now, if you were to go look at ladder of inference on the internet, you'll find lots of pictures of ladders. And there's differences about the exact number of rungs, what you call them, all that kind of stuff.
That's not the important part.
Yeah, but we really like this one because it makes a very clear distinction between the elements of the ladder that are happening in the world and
put here, somewhere out there. Yep.
And the steps of the ladder that are happening in your head.
Yep, in here.
And so the important part of this model is that you automatically, instantaneously, when there's a stimulus, which is something that happens in the real world, like someone says something, you automatically jump up the ladder to beliefs and then actions you take. So you say Folkestone, I'm like, that's dumb, there are no penguins. But what I didn't do here is I was not curious. I didn't say, by the way, can you tell me why you think Folkestone's a good idea? What's the reasoning behind it? And I didn't share my own ladder. Look, penguins are awesome. And I think everyone enjoys penguins. We can probably get a lot of funding from all those Linux people out there because they're going to love Penguins.
Yep.
And so many of our users use Linux. Like, I think it's a natural synergy. Penguins, DevOps Enterprise Summit. It's going to be awesome. So not
very good reasoning, but it's not reasoning I bothered to listen to because I'm fixated on Folkestone. That's what's not going to be so helpful.
And because the other element here is this loop, right? Our beliefs about the world will tend to act as a filter on what data we even observe happening. We will tend to hear evidence and arguments that support our behavior or our beliefs, and we'll tend to ignore and omit evidence that would work counter to our belief.
There you go.
People heard of selection bias before. That's what it is.
Exactly.
Or one example.
And I think we didn't quite explain it. I just want to make sure it's very clear. This picture shows that two things are outside the head, and they're the only two. What you actually observe, what a video camera would record, and what you do.
Right.
So if I hear Jeffrey, and he said, I think we should go to Antarctica, that's an observable fact. That Jeffrey said those words that came out of his mouth. We all heard them.
Shows up on it.
Me pounding on the table and saying, we should go to Folkestone is an action. We can observe that. That's on the video. You can see me doing that. But all the actions that happened between there where I said, oh man, penguins, he's on about penguins again. We don't really use Linux, and my assumption is that he's an idiot, and so on. All of that's missing, and nobody gets to see that. They only get to see the action.
And another thing that here, even if you saw the action that Squirrel pounded on, he didn't pound angrily. Angrily doesn't show up on a video camera.
I might have felt angry, or I might not.
Right.
But you can't tell.
Right. And so in the latter here, I can see the data that what happened was that he pounded, and then the meaning I added was that he was angry. Right. So that's an example of how the latter works. So we have this model. This is the things we introduce to people as a way of slowing down and understanding the process happening consciously and saying, look, if you believe what you said before about wanting to be curious, it means asking people about their ladder. If you want to believe what you said before about being transparent and sharing your own ideas, it means sharing your ladder. So this is an example of a tool we can introduce, and that was one of the first tools that we brought into Parts Unlimited.
Exactly.
When what happens in the normal world, when people aren't doing this, what you end up is something we call dueling ladders. So we could, rather than being curious and sharing about our ladder, we can just each of us be at the top of our ladder saying, I think we should do the release. And
well, obviously, no, we shouldn't. That's completely wrong.
But look, it's really important. Like people are relying on us.
I agree, it's important. That's why we shouldn't do it.
But look, we made a commitment. We have to follow through.
If you've ever watched Sunday chat shows, you've seen this happen. So you've got two people who are saying, we need to open the borders and have lots of immigration. Somebody else says we should close the borders, keep all those people out. And they never, you notice, say, actually, that's a really good point. That's interesting. Can you tell me more about, maybe could I join your party? That never happens. And that's because they're operating at the tops of their ladders and they're not trying to understand each other. That may or may not work in politics. We won't touch that one, but it certainly doesn't work in business. And it was killing Parts Unlimited.
That's right. You just have people who have a fixed position and their own view of the world. They're not sharing. They're not curious. So you have to get past that. And there's a technique to do it. And we're going to walk you through what we did. And what we're going to walk you through right now is something we taught in the workshops. And this is actually a technique that we walked through with Steve about how he could prepare for his conversation with Bill. And it's the 4 R's.
And of course, there are 6 of them.
Yeah, well, so
consistency, it's not overrated.
The 6 4 R's
yep.
are steps you're going to walk through for analyzing your conversations and learning from them so you can develop the skill. And the 4 R's are record the conversation. Now, importantly, the recording can be something that hasn't happened yet.
So that's what we did with Steve.
That's right.
We said, hey, Steve, you're having this conversation with Bill. Let's record what you think how it could go.
That's right. So in preparing, you can write up, you can say, this is going to be terrible. I know exactly how it's going to go. We'll write out how you think it's going to go. We'll give you the format for how to record in just a minute.
And of course, you can also do it for one you have had. So you can say,
right.
When Bill resigned, this is what actually happened. I said this, he said that.
That's
so
right.
Both work.
Having recorded it, you're going to then reflect. And this means essentially scoring. And you're going to say, was I transparent? Was I curious? And there'll be some other tools that we'll talk about that you use. But in general, no matter what framework, what kind of approach you're taking to the given conversation, you're going to be scoring it in the reflect stage. to find areas that you could improve.
Mm-hmm.
And that's then where you're going to say, right, having found these problems, let's revise it. Let's try to write out an alternative. What could I have been saying that would be more productive? And to be clear, you're focusing on what you can do differently, especially when you look back. You're not saying, well, it all would have been great if only Squirrel had not started as such a jerk and he hadn't started with that dumb Folkson idea. Like, that's not it. You're looking at your own conversation, your own contribution to say, what could I do? And revise and come up with an alternative that's more transparent, more curious, or otherwise more skillful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that happens is that very often when people will write this out, they'll then actually go back and reflect, like score their alternative version. And it's really common that your first revision, especially when you're first beginning, is no better than what you had originally.
That's okay. That just means that you're learning.
So you get to repeat at this point.
Yep.
You get to go back, score yourself again, revise again, and you're going to go on this loop until you can produce something in writing that you're like, yeah, okay, this is reasonable. I'm getting a better result for transparency. I'm getting a better result for curiosity. Once you've done that, and that might take you 5, 6, 7, 10 times to get something you're happy with, you then want to move on to the next test, which is role play. So it's best, if you have to, you can role play with yourself, roll in a mirror, practice speaking out loud, but it's really better if you can get someone, a partner, someone you trust, to say, hey, look, I'm trying to get this conversation, and this is what we did with Steve over the video call. We had him, after he revised, role play with us, and he would practice speaking his revised dialogue.
Which sounded really weird to him.
Yeah, exactly.
It was tough to do at first.
And we played from his script, the part of Bill.
Mm-hmm.
And he got to say, like, could I actually say these things I thought about saying? Sometimes we'll write things and think it sounds good, but when we try to say it out loud, no, that's not right.
Yep.
Again, you revise till it's something that he felt good with. Then this is really insightful. You do role reversal. Have the other person take your part and see what it sounds like. And I think this was where there was a real eye-opening moment for Steve, because he realized that he came across very authoritarian, not at all curious, and it was he was just sort of ordering Bill,
come back to work.
Back to work. And he went, wait a minute, that's not going to work.
Exactly.
And so we're back to
a further round of revision in order to improve.
That's
and
right.
Have a much better conversation.
Well, he realized it was something he was comfortable saying, but he wasn't comfortable hearing. And so that role reversal, each one of these steps in writing, in speaking, and hearing will give you different insights. Having done all this, you can say, right, I have something now that is, generally speaking, much better than what I did originally, and you've gotten a lot of practice along the way. You really start developing these conversational skills so that when you're in real conversations, you've had some practice and you're more likely to generate curiosity and transparency in the moment. And that's the goal. That's what we're aiming to do here, is to make it something that you have as a new habit, that your reflexive response is to be curious, to ask questions, to be transparent.
Mm.
So we said we'd tell you how to do recording. It's not very high tech. We generally recommend people start with pen and paper.
Low tech is much better.
Right. A lot of people would like to go ahead and do this electronically. If you want to, a lot of times people will have Slack transcripts or emailed chains.
It's less helpful. It doesn't do as good a job.
Those work, but if you're going to put it together digitally, then go ahead and print it out, because then I think what I find very insightful is the mechanical process of scoring.
Mm-hmm. So what you're going to do is if you're going to write it by hand, is you're going to get a piece of paper and fold it in half, and you need a pen. And then your preparation is done. You've done all the preparatory work that you need to.
You're ready to
printing and other stuff like that. You can do, give yourself a nice line down the middle. You can, but you just need 2 columns and a pen. And then what you're going to do is write on the right-hand side what you and the other person said. This is the transparency we were talking about. This is things at the bottom of the ladder, what you are observing. And that goes in the right-hand column. And on the left-hand column goes the things that it would be helpful if you could be transparent about. Those are the things that you thought but didn't say, things that were happening in your brain that the other person could not observe. By the way, be careful, unless any of you are telepaths, and if you are, please tell us, we have some new business ideas for you. Unless you're a telepath, you can't write what the other person was thinking. The same way you couldn't tell that I was angry when I was pounding on the table. I might have also been sad or disappointed or something else. And then what are we going to do with it at that point?
Well, then you're going to be ready to reflect. And what you're going to end up is scoring the paper And you can see here, you'll see some in the slides, some red marks. And on the right-hand side, we've gone ahead and marked the question of, we're going to start with looking for, are we being curious? So what you do is mechanically, you'll look in your dialogue and circle the question marks. So in this case, we have a case study here between Norbert and Quinn, and this is Norbert's case. How would we know from looking at it that it's Norbert's case?
Well, on the left-hand side, Sarah, it says what Norbert thought.
Yeah, exactly. That's the key thing. If this is about what Norbert was thinking, then it's Norbert's case. Quinn couldn't be writing about what Norbert's thinking. Mm-hmm. So we're going to look at this, in this example, we're going to look at the questions and say, Norbert, what questions do you have? And he did have one question.
Why didn't we ask the team about KVM?
Right. And now the question is,
why don't we ask them?
Once you've looked at it, does it say like, so those questions, are they genuine?
And so a genuine question is actually easiest to explain by describing a non-genuine question. A non-genuine question would be, we really should use KVM because it's much better than all the other alternatives, isn't it, Jeffrey? That's got a question mark at the end, but it's pretty forceful. And I'm trying to convince Jeffrey. I'm in that convincing, trying to win mode. I'm not in curiosity mode where I'm wondering what Jeffrey's thinking. What's in Jeffrey's ladder? What's in Jeffrey's head? I'm wondering what the situation is. And here, in Norbert's case, if you read the left-hand side, he's quite an advocate of KVM. He would really like to use that tool. Yeah. So this probably is not a genuine question. Only Norbert knows, but it's very likely not to be.
Yeah, and the key here, so you're describing a non-genuine question. One of the tests of a genuine question is, would the answer change your mind? Mm-hmm. Now, you might be gathering information that you don't know the answer to. So, for example, when he asks, well, why don't we ask the team? What's his goal here? The point is that he actually knows that the team favors KVM.
He's not being transparent about that.
And he's not being transparent about it. So when he asks the question, he's actually advocating something he knows the answer to.
He's trying to gather evidence to bolster his case.
That's right. He's not curious actually about Quinn's reasoning.
Don't get credit for that one. That's not generative. That's not the direction we're trying to go.
So he asks a question, but it's not a genuine question.
Exactly.
So when you do this, if you've got your case and you find out that in fact you ask no questions at all, very clearly not curious. If you find you asking questions but they're not genuine, again, not good. So your goal when you score then is you find all these ones and you give yourself a score of the number of genuine questions over the number of total questions. In the case here of Norbert, then he'd have a score of 0 over 1.
Yep. And a very common score, by the way, is 0 over 0.
Yeah.
So no questions at all. You're allowed to divide by 0 in this fraction.
Yeah.
It's not good. It's something you want to address, but it's a good signal for you.
Right. And then the next thing you're looking for is your transparency. If you look at the left-hand column, what are the things that you thought or felt but didn't share at all on the right, and you just underline them? And
so not much training needed. Everybody's already using it. That he doesn't share that. So we would underline that side,
right?
That sentence. And it could be that you share it in a less direct way. So you could be thinking, gosh, Jeffrey is really an idiot for favoring penguins. And I could say, Jeffrey, I really disagree with that penguin idea. It just doesn't seem like it's well thought through. That would be a more constructive way to share the information. So I get credit for that. I wouldn't underline that.
Right.
And typically when we do this with a red pen and we walk around, it looks like everybody's bled on the left-hand side.
Right. So there's all kinds of things that I'm sharing.
And there's not much on the right-hand side because there's no
very few questions
being asked. Yep. And that's normal, but that's your signal to do some revision. Because of course what you'd like to do is move those things in a constructive way from the left to the right. Gee, I think the whole team is really in favor of KVM. Quinn, why don't you think about this? That would be a more helpful way to share that information.
Now, when we do this reflecting, and this, which is the scoring part, we always start with the sort of very fundamental questions of curiosity and transparency. That's going to be the foundation for everything else that comes later. And one of the types of things that will come later is patterns of behavior. You start to realize there are things that are triggers, things that will set you off every time they happen. In the case here for Norbert, as he went through it, he realized he had a real issue around the desire for autonomy, and that what he described as what he felt was like real hypocrisy between what Quinn was saying, which is I want to empower the team, but then in fact every time something came up, it wasn't happening. So this means he could recognize, after having looked through a few of his transcripts, he realized that every time issues around autonomy and team decision empowerment came up, and Quinn didn't behave the way that Norbert thought he should, that would be consistent with it, it was just a major emotional trigger, and he had trouble being productive in the conversation after that. That was very useful learning from him.
And working on this kind of conversational analysis is exactly what we did with Steve. Took him through the recording that he'd done, and we helped him to revise, to move things from left to right, to increase his curiosity and to look for triggers.
Right, which is the next step here, as we said, revise. And
we can't show you Steve's case, sorry. The Parts Unlimited won't let us. It's confidentiality. But we do have this one.
Right, we got permission from Norbert and
Norbert and Quinn are all right, yep.
Within the IT department, IT operations.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see here that Norbert has revised what he said in a few different ways. First of all, his questions, he has more of them,
mm-hmm.
And they're more genuine. That's a real improvement.
Improved his curiosity, yep.
Second, he's sharing much more of his actual knowledge, his thoughts and feelings. So for example, up front, rather than saying, hey, how don't we ask the team? He actually says, look, I already know that I believe they all know KVM, and I think it's worth checking with them. But I think that's something that he's sharing his reasoning up front for why it'd be good to check with the team. And then he genuinely asks Quinn, do you think that would be a good step? Quinn comes back and he doesn't like what Quinn has to say, but he understands that autonomy is a trigger for him, and he has a more productive response. He's like, hey, I realize now that when you said this about autonomy, or when you said about the decision that you need to hold on to it, that actually that
doesn't sit well with
me.
Yep.
Can we talk about it?
Yeah.
So he's used his revision to come up with something that's much more productive on every dimension.
And certainly we wouldn't say this is a perfect conversation, but
no.
Norbert would be feeling a lot better about this and much more likely to lead to better outcomes.
And
this is what happened again and again at Parts Unlimited.
That's right.
They had more of these conversations.
Right.
And were able to transform the culture much more effectively.
That's right. And we'll talk in a bit about the kind of workshops that we had, but this is an example that Norbert brought this in, was able to revise it. And one of the things about these conversations, especially with colleagues, is you can often go back and have them again. He was able to go back to Quinn and say, we had that conversation before. I was really upset. I went to the workshop and I have this revision. Can we try having this conversation another time? And it was able to be much more productive.
Great. We'll share these slides, by the way, so we know there's a whole lot of text here, but have a look at them afterwards. You'll see how the dialogue changed.
Right. Role play, and this is a common thing. We'll have people go and try revising, sharing the revision, practice saying it. It really does take practice to start saying things like, actually, when you said that, I felt myself getting upset.
Yeah. We had a great example this morning where somebody was telling someone else they were rude, and the revised version was, when you said that, it made me feel small.
You're right.
That was a much more effective way to, rather than name calling, you're rude,
yeah,
to share the feelings. But that doesn't come naturally. It requires practice, and role play can help you with that.
That's right. And as we said, role play will often come with, will typically do with role reversal as well, so you can hear what it says, both to say it and to hear it.
Indeed.
Now, what's the outcome? This is a lot of work, but you're building skills in conversation. With these improved conversational skills, there is very, very predictable outcomes. Most importantly, you start having improved relationships. And part of that is because you're going to have increased trust. I was working with a client recently, and they were talking about the trust issues they have, and we were looking at their dialogue, and they said, well, look what happens here. You have this thing the person says about the lack of trust that they have, but then you don't ask any questions and you don't share how you're feeling. Does that sound like the basis of trust for you? And he'd admit that no, actually that doesn't. When you start asking questions, if I start asking Squirrel, can you tell me more about Folkson? When I can demonstrate that I understand what was motivating him.
You're walking up the ladder of inference, that test-driven development, right, that you're doing to understand the situation better slowly.
That's right. Even if we don't agree, at least I can demonstrate that I understand, then that will help Squirrel trust that I'm paying attention. And when I then also share how I'm feeling, and then my actions are consistent with what he knows about me, that's what is really going to build trust. And of course, we're bringing more information together. So what would you expect is you get better decisions.
This is what you guys all said we know, even though we haven't looked in the chat. You guys were saying if we could do these things, we'd have better decisions. Guess what? You get better decisions.
That's right.
There's actually a step-by-step process for getting the actions that we all struggle to have happen.
And better leadership, because you're going to have much better alignment across the organization when you have people sharing their information in a much more generative way, as opposed to an environment where people are afraid to share or felt like there's no point in sharing because all that matters is the bureaucracy.
Yep.
Now, the one thing I want to say, though, is that while this is very possible, we have evidence from Part Summit and others that it happens. To be clear, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not something that comes with understanding. You listen to our webinar, you've heard about the skills. That is good, but it's not sufficient. It's like we've just explained how a piano works. You can understand how a piano works perfectly and then not be able to play piano at all.
Yep.
And that's what is conversations. This is a skill you need to develop through practice. And at Parts Unlimited, you can see that they made a real ongoing commitment. And this is key. This is what really made the transformation happen. It wasn't sitting around a bunch of slides. It wasn't watching a webinar. It was consistent practice that was reinforced again and again in practice sessions and then later in meetings, live and online.
Well, you were frustrated by that conversation with the IT director. And so where's your case? Did you write that down? You know, the left hand, right hand? Let's have a look at that. Oh, you didn't write one. Well, let's write one together.
That's right.
That's the sort of interaction you have to have over and over again.
And as for a corporation the size of Parts Unlimited, you see this happening at multiple levels. So first there was leadership team offsites, originally with the executive team, but then also getting into other business units. So we had those cross-functional leadership teams would have their offsites to get aligned. And then as you get down into the business, each team would have their own workshop so they could start learning how to work together. And then we went around and trained a bunch of people to facilitate meetings so they could live online help people use the skills and say things like, you know, I heard you asking this question, but I'm not really understanding what you hope to get out of it. Can you share more of what you're thinking in asking the question? Mm-hmm. Or I heard you argue for Folkestone, but no real evidence. Can you provide your reasoning? And the facilitators could help everyone practice using the skills in real meetings. Finally, Parts Unlimited did something really neat as part of their culture when they said we need to be much more innovative and have much more emphasis on learning. They did these teaching Thursdays where everyone in the company, Thursdays, were supposed to be learning new skills. And so early on in the transformation, you and I were on site, would run these sort of groups for people who were interested. And then those continued ongoing, and we started coming just monthly and then quarterly. But we saw this as an ongoing. People knew that every Thursday they could take their cases to a group who were interested in helping them improve and practice their skills. And that ongoing practice is what really made the difference. Now,
and of course, it helps the new people as well, that they get acculturated and to understand how Parts Unlimited handles these kinds of problems.
That's right. Not everyone went, and no one went to every Thursday, but the fact that people knew they could go there when they needed it really helped. Chris Argyris, the person who invented this, he says, look, it takes to get good at conversations, takes about as long as it takes to play a not so bad game of tennis, which means you're going to improve, but it is going to take a while. And it's really the good news, though, is that you have a chance to practice much more often in the workplace your conversations than you do practice tennis. Mm-hmm. People get kind of upset if you start hitting the tennis ball around the office.
But you're going to have conversations right after this, and all the rest of the day, and tomorrow, and the day after that.
Right. So everything we've talked about here, you'll be able to find it in our upcoming book in May, Agile Conversations. We'll tell you how to transform your conversations and transform your culture. Available for pre-order now. And are there any questions? And I think we're going to go ahead and take a quick look over at the questions that we have here first in Zoom.
I'm not sure.
And
okay,
then
Zoom.
Then we'll see if we can pull up Slack.
I'm not sure if we have Slack.
Yeah.
So
if you'd like, I can read them off. I've been taking note of that.
If you wouldn't mind that, Alex. That would make it simpler for us.
Okay.
And we know we're running a little bit over time. Some folks might have to leave. That's okay, but we can hang around for a few minutes. I've got a plane to catch, not immediately.
Okay. All right. Let's do these. The first one came early. It was when you were talking about the 3 approaches to transformation. And the question was, how is this different from control culture, competence culture, cultivation culture, collaboration culture model? Is it sort of the same thing with different names?
Could be. That's not a model I know. Jeffrey is often more of our theoretician between the two of us.
Yeah.
Do you know that particular model?
That's not That one is not one I've heard of before. So,
okay. Sounds similar, but we're not experts on that one. So
I think what's different, just from hearing the names, is what I didn't hear in that model you're describing was sort of the punitive aspect that can happen in the pathological case.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that you're describing one sort of perhaps the control culture was that, and I think that I would need to know more about those kind of details.
Yeah.
It's that sort of punitive aspect of pathological that's so
shoot the match there. Yeah.
Yeah, is so typical.
Okay. Do you want to feed us another one, Alex?
Yep. Okay. So the next one, the full text is, thanks for very good info. You talked about the transformation at Parts Unlimited. The organization has 3 main parts: business, manufacturing, and technology, also known as IT, DevOps, etc. Can you describe differences and similarities between Parts Unlimited and companies like Tesla, Boeing, etc.? Tesla and Co. have big departments for R&D with Mech, CAD, PLM, etc. to develop products. That is also technology, can be called industrial DevOps, systems engineering, CPS, cyber.
Let me just stop you, because that's great detail, but I don't think any of it matters. And the reason I don't think any of it matters is because each of those organizations is made up of people, and the people have a culture. And the point we're making is that whatever your organization, however it might be organized, whether it's really R&D heavy, like most of the small startups that I sometimes consult with, or if you're Boeing or Walmart or something gigantic, and you're very traditional and you probably aren't using as much technology. Doesn't matter, because the culture is going to be similar, and you're going to be held up by the same difficulties of poor conversations, blocking you making good decisions. And what we think we have is something that we've seen over and over and over again work very well to solve problems at all types. So the details are interesting. Happy to talk with you more about that topic. Get in touch with us. All our details are here, by the way. If you want to find us, just go to conversationaltransformation.com. You can get in touch. We'd love to talk more about that, but the details aren't the important thing. I think it's the culture that matters.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would say is what we were highlighting at Parts Unlimited, which is often the case, is when you're moving people that have traditionally been separate, like they had IT separate from the business, and you start wanting them to work together collaboratively, that's really where you get certainly this culture clash, and that's where it becomes particularly important. Whereas in the manufacturing case, you can see that's something where they'd already had embedded IT for a long time, and they had a much more collaborative relationship on the manufacturing side.
But that was true at Parts Unlimited. At, say, Boeing, if we want to pull something from the headlines, I really hope that whoever's in charge of safety at Boeing is spending an awful lot more time with people who are making Boeing software and Boeing airplanes, because they seem to have some serious problems.
But, and I think you can, to riff on that, if you go back at Boeing as an example, what I've read is there's been a change in the engineering culture after their merger with McDonnell Douglas, that under Boeing before the merger, they had a real separation between the military side and the commercial side. They had different cultures because what you need to do in those environments is very different. Post the merger, they started bringing the Department of Defense culture, those managements took over, and they brought I would say best
a bureaucratic approach,
but actually what they brought was a pathological culture into the engineering side, and that the reason there are headlines now, I've heard the argument, is a result of bringing a pathological culture into someplace that previously had a generative culture. That old Boeing before the merger in the commercial aviation side had a very generative culture where the focus was on the mission. And then after the merger and the change of the merger of cultures, that this pathological management culture came in and severely impacted the output of that organization.
Certainly seems to have done. So equal opportunities to screw up at different types of organizations. That can happen anywhere.
But Squirrel is exactly right, which is the key is what we're talking about is things that about people. And so the conversational elements are true because there's humans.
There we go. I think we might be able to take 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay.
What's yours, Alex?
I think the next one, it was kind of along the same lines. It was about how these conversations are at FANG companies versus Parts Unlimited. I think you, do you want to address that, or did that get addressed?
I think same answer,
Same answer.
Okay. The next one is, what is the role of human-centered and service design in digital transformation? My experience, I've seen it it's a combination of culture, people, process, and technology, empathy for our users and one another. How does the role of empathy factor into this conversational transformation?
Well, one of the things we really liked about Parts Unlimited, which was, I think, really helpful to them in making the change, is that they have always, since whatever it was, 1914, had a principle of user interaction for everyone. So leaders had to go and work on the floor, actually selling real car parts to real people. That was part of their culture from the beginning, and we were able to build on that, and they, more importantly, they were able to build on that, so that they were able to say, look, we're going to use some of these tools to have better conversations. Guess what? With our users. Yeah. What a crazy idea that maybe we could understand what's happening to our users better. They had that principle kind of in their DNA, but they had lost it a bit. And so Max, for example, talked with us about not being she was interacting very much with the people on the shop floors, in the factories. That was in her generative culture. But when she got over to the Phoenix project, man, that was just, nobody had talked to any users ever, and they had no idea what was frustrating for them. And
the question I heard there at the end was the role of empathy. Mm-hmm. And I think empathy is absolutely key. In the idea, I'm glad because you mentioned here empathy both for our users and our customers, but also empathy for our colleagues. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been one of the big changes here at Parts Unlimited and other companies we work with, is a lot of places where there's conflict, especially the most bitter conflict, is where people don't have empathy for one another. They mm-hmm. don't understand.
There are those idiots in operations. They just keep us from releasing. They just wake up in the morning thinking, how can they make us more frustrated?
Right, and they have no concept of the kind of pains and struggles that other people are dealing with. They don't really know what the other people are valuing. And guess what? Everyone is doing, in my experience, basically, everyone is doing the best they can in the situation they find themselves in with the information that they have to hand, right?
And just saying that isn't enough. You have to do more, and that's where user-centered design is certainly a part of that. Interacting with your users, going out on the shop floor, all of those are ways of realizing that, but it's hard work, and you have to practice it.
Yeah, that's right. So I think I see this elevation of empathy as very important in any sort of transformation. So anytime you bring groups of people together to collaborate.
And so I'd expect user-centered design to be an element, and certainly it is a much greater element, say, of Parts Unlimited's design of its app, which used to be a running joke and now is actually very useful in driving revenue. That's an outcome of having made the conversational transformation first, and then you're able to make use of these very good techniques like user-centered design. Cool. Do you have one more for us, Alex?
Yeah, I grouped them together. There are 3 questions about materials that you might be familiar with and if they had any influence. So the first one is, you read the book, How We Talk Can Change the Way We Work by Kagan Leahy. The following one is, somebody felt like part of what you were saying was reminding them of Getting to Yes by Fish, Curry, and Patton.
We cite that extensively in Agile Conversations, so there's a whole section on negotiation and improvement in that way. So Getting to Yes, we know well. Keep going.
Okay, and then Mark wrote in awesome stuff. I can use this today for a situation that he's facing. Have you heard of the drama triangle? Victim, rescuer, persecutor.
We know that well. It's not in the book, but that's when we were introduced to, at least I was, by a good friend, a kind of sensei of ours, who brought us to that one. So the first one, I haven't read that. Have you?
I don't, but the title is very consistent with our thesis.
Sounds great. We should go read that one. Stick that in Slack if you haven't, so that we pick it up later.
But the last one, the drama triangle, which is like games people play, transactional analysis. I think that's there's a very good connection here with the conversational analysis that we do. As I said, you'll learn many things. We talked about triggers, but one of the things you'll realize is the same 4-hour process will help you with different tools you're trying to learn. So if you're looking at transaction analysis, you're like, oh wait, here I am, playing the victim. Oh, and here I move to the rescuer role. Now so you can see yourself moving through the different roles of the drama triangle. You can develop that insight from analyzing the conversations. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because the 4R steps we have is very generic. And that reflect stat, where you go ahead and score what you're doing, works with all kinds of different conversational models.
And we take you through 5 of those. We don't happen to do the drama triangle. We just did. The
Right.
IT Revolution didn't give us enough pages. In the sequel, we'll do that. But we take you through for a bunch of different techniques, one of them being the ladder of inference, but several others. What scoring can you use? What analysis can you do? How can you improve the conversation?
Yeah.
The book is full of those 2-column conversations, which we analyze and work with you on, so that you
With different tools.
With all the different tools, exactly. Cool. I'm having a feeling we should probably stop because we're 15 minutes over and I have a plane to catch. So
Okay.
Might do that, but we'll just invite everybody again. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate it. We'll invite you to come to conversationaltransformation.com. We have a regular newsletter. We have free videos. We have all kinds of things you can do, and including pre-ordering the book. So in May, you can get your own copy of Agile Conversations and a lot more of these suggestions and ideas. Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you so much for coming. That was amazing. That was really amazing. We'll close this down now. Thank you, everybody, for coming on to this webinar this morning, or whatever time it is for you in the day. And we'll see you in Slack.
All right. See ya.